Ruth Ballard was 34 years old, widowed 1 year. And for 11 weeks, the town of Alder Bend had been telling a story about her that she had never once lived. You could watch it happen. She'd come through the door of the general store on a Saturday, and the talk along the counter would drop to a hush. Just like that. The women would find something to study on the shelves. The men would clear their throats. Ruth would walk to the counter and pay her account in cash, and she would not flinch. Not once. But the story kept hardening anyway. It started from nothing. A lamp seen burning late in her window, a traveling drummer who tipped his hat to her one afternoon on the road. That was all. That was the whole of it. And out of that nothing, they built a fact. A widow that keeps her porch lamp burning that late, they said, is advertising for company. 40 Sunday dinners repeated that line until it turned true. Not because it happened, because everyone had heard it. So one Saturday, worn thin, Ruth did something. She stood at that counter and she asked a gray-headed rancher, 61 years old, a stockman of standing, a man who had known her people for 20 years, one quiet thing. What he did in answer was not what she asked. Not even close. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, for the second chance a person never expected, then this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and subscribe, and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Every name in the comments tells me somebody out there still believes in this. All right, let's begin. Alder Bend sat on the western slope of Colorado, up in the Uncompahgre country, a Denver and Rio Grande trading town with one long street and a rail spur that carried cattle down out of the high valleys every fall. September of 1889. The aspens on the ridges had just started to turn, that first hard gold that means the cold is coming. It was a plain town, honest enough on most days, the kind of place where a man's word closed a deal at the stockyard and no paper needed signing after. 2 miles out, on a small hay place her husband had left her, Ruth Ballard kept on living. Elias Ballard had died a year back at the river ford when a loaded wagon turned over on him in the current. Ruth had buried him and kept the place. She cut her own hay. She drove into town alone on Saturdays. She paid cash, and she owed no man $1. Understand that about her, because the town chose to forget it. She owed no one. She asked for nothing. And she was good. Not good the way people say when they mean quiet and out of the way. Good in the way that costs you something. The winter before, when the Pruitt baby took the croup so bad the child couldn't draw a full breath, it was Ruth Ballard who came. She sat up 3 nights running in that house. 3 nights. She held that baby over a steaming kettle and rubbed its little back and did not sleep. And the child lived. The Pruitts had thanked her with tears standing in their eyes. Now hold on to that, because when the talk started, it was the Pruitts who talked first. The very same mouth that had thanked her was the first to turn. That's the town. Now let me show you the man. Isaac Coldwell ran the Coldwell brand up the valley and had for 30 years. 61 now, gray all through. A big, deliberate man who did nothing fast. He'd built a herd and a name to go with it, and out on the shipping pens his word alone could move $1,000 of beef without a single line of ink. Men trusted him because he had never once given them a reason not to. He was a widower. 9 years his wife Ada had been gone. On Sundays he sat alone at the near end of the church pew, hat on his knee, and he did not remarry and did not complain and did not explain himself to anybody. Here's the small thing you need to notice about Isaac Coldwell. When Ruth Ballard came into the store and every other voice in the place dropped low, Isaac's did not. He was the one man in Alder Bend who never lowered his voice when that woman walked in. He'd go right on talking about wire and weather and winter feed in his ordinary tone, as if nothing at all had changed in the room. Most folks never marked it. Ruth did. A person in her position marks every small mercy. She just never thought it meant anything. A man too old and too settled to bother with the gossip, she figured. That was all. She was wrong about that. But it would take her a long while to learn how wrong. Now, the talk. You ought to understand how a thing like that gets built, because it never comes from where you'd think. It didn't come from a lie somebody told on purpose. That's the part that makes it so hard to answer. Nobody stood up and swore to a falsehood. It grew. Somebody driving past the Ballard place after dark noticed the lamp still lit in the front window, later than a woman alone had any cause to burn oil. That was the seed. And oil costs money, and a careful widow doesn't waste it, and so, why? Why would she keep it burning? And a person filled in the blank the way a small mind fills a blank, and passed the filling along as though it were the fact. Then the drummer, a traveling salesman, came through in the spring, selling sewing notions and patent tonics, and he passed Ruth on the road and tipped his hat to her, the way a man tips his hat to any woman on any road. She nodded back. That was the entire thing. But somebody saw it, and by the time it reached the third telling, the drummer had stopped his wagon. By the fifth, he'd stopped for an hour. By the 10th, well, you know how it goes. You've watched it happen in your own town, maybe. Maybe it's happened to you. 11 weeks it ran, and each week it set a little harder, the way a wagon rut sets after rain and then bakes in the sun until nothing short of a pick will break it. By the end, there was no fact left to fight. If Ruth had stood up in the middle of the church and sworn on the book that not one word of it was true, they would have looked at her and thought, well, of course she'd say that. That's the trap in it. Once the story's hard enough, a denial only feeds it. Silence feeds it. Everything feeds it. Della Coldwell was the one who put words to it in front of Ruth, though even Della didn't mean it cruel. Della was Isaac's daughter-in-law, married to his son Tom, and she carried the family name the way some women carry a good dish across a crowded room, braced, careful, certain it's about to be knocked. One afternoon in the store, low, almost kindly, Della said it plain. I'd think about that lamp, if I were her. A woman alone can't afford to look like anything. It's not fair, but it's true. The looking is the thing. She said it as a caution, as advice. She'd have told you she was being Christian about it, and that is exactly how the cruelest talk always travels, not on malice, but on caution, passed hand to hand by people who'd swear they meant well. Ruth heard it. She was 2 shelves over, and she heard every word, and she kept her face still, and bought her flour and drove home. Now here's a small moment I need you to hold, because it comes back at the very end of this, and when it does, it will change everything you thought you understood. It was around this time, a Saturday, and Isaac Coldwell was at the counter buying fence wire, paying it out, coil by coil, and half to himself, not to anybody in particular, looking at nothing, he said, "This town ran a good woman clean out, one hard winter, years back. Ran her right into the ground and then called it weather." That was all. He didn't say who. He didn't say when. He didn't look at Ruth, who was near enough to hear it, and Ruth barely marked it, one more old man muttering over his wire. Nobody asked him which woman. Nobody asked which winter. The words just dropped into the room and lay there and were stepped over, the way you step over a thing on the floor you don't want to bend down and pick up. Remember it. That's all I'll say for now. Remember that he said it. By that point, Ruth had stopped sleeping right. It wears on a person, being talked about. It's a particular kind of tired. Not the tired of hard work, she knew that kind, and didn't mind it. This was the other kind. The kind where you feel eyes on your back in an empty room. Where you rehearse conversations that haven't happened. Where you catch yourself explaining, out loud, to nobody, in your own kitchen. And one night she sat at that kitchen table, the lamp burning, yes, the very lamp, with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her. and she made herself think it through like a problem in arithmetic. Cold. Plain. What could a woman actually do against a whole town's made-up mind? She couldn't deny it. Denial fed it. She couldn't leave. The place was all she had, and running would only prove the story right. She couldn't fight each person, one at a time. There weren't enough hours, and every argument won made 3 enemies. She turned it over and over, and she kept coming back to the same small, hopeless answer, the only one she could find. If the story was that no decent person would sit with her, then let a decent person sit with her. Let the town see it. Once, in the open, where they couldn't pretend they hadn't. Not a speech, not a fight, just the plain sight of somebody respectable choosing to be next to her, in front of God and everyone, on a day when the whole town was watching. And the most respectable person she could think of, the one man whose standing was so solid the talk couldn't touch it, the one man who never lowered his voice when she came in, was old Isaac Coldwell. It was a small plan, a modest one. She'd have told you that herself. She only wanted to borrow a little of somebody's good name for the length of one Sunday dinner. She never once thought about what it might cost the man she borrowed it from. That was Ruth's blind spot, and it's worth naming because it's the thing this whole story turns on. She thought a good name was a thing a man could lend and get back whole. She was about to learn it doesn't work that way. Not the way Isaac Coldwell meant to spend it. She waited 3 more days before she found the nerve. Saturday, trading day. The store was full, women at the dry goods, men out front at the wagons, the counters stacked with accounts to settle. Ruth came in with her list and her account book, and she did what she always did. She waited. She let the crowd thin. She watched for Isaac. He came to the counter to pay for a keg of nails, and the moment came, and Ruth's heart was going like a bird against a window, but her voice, when it came out, was steady. She'd practiced it steady. There were 2 women near enough to hear. The Vance sisters, pretending to weigh a bolt of calico, their ears turned like 2 cats, and Ruth knew they were there, and she asked anyway. Low, because if she waited for privacy in that town, she'd wait forever. "Mr. Coldwell," she said, "would you sit with me so they stop talking?" He turned and looked at her. Didn't answer yet. So she said the rest of it, all in a rush now, quiet, before her nerve gave out. "At Sunday dinner. At the church. If they saw me sitting with somebody like you, somebody they respect, just once, in the open, maybe they'd let it go. That's all. That's all I'm asking. I know it's a strange thing to ask, but you're the only one I could think to ask it of." There. It was out. It hung in the air between them. The Vance sisters had gone very still over their calico. And Isaac Coldwell did not say yes to Sunday. What he did was take off his hat. He held it in both his big hands, down in front of him, and he turned the brim of it slow, working it around through his fingers. Once, twice, the way a man does when he's holding a thing bigger than the moment seems to call for. He looked at that hat like the answer was written on the band of it, and the silence stretched long enough that Ruth felt the whole cost of having asked settle onto her shoulders. She'd said it out loud now, in front of the Vance sisters, in front of the town by supper time. She'd asked a man to sit with her, and if he said no, it would be one more true thing they could say about her. But he didn't say no either. He set the hat back on his head, and all he said was this: "I'll come by your place Saturday. Noon." That was it. That was the whole of his answer. Not Sunday. Not the church. Not the dinner she'd asked for. Saturday. Noon. Her place. A different day, a different hour, a different thing entirely, and he offered no word of why. He paid for his nails and he touched his hat brim to her alone, not to the Vance sisters, not to the room. And he walked out into the September sun and left her standing there with her account book, more confused than when she'd come in. By the time Ruth got her wagon turned for home, 3 people on the street already knew she'd asked. By dark it was 30. The widow Ballard had walked right up to old Coldwell at the counter and asked him to sit with her. Bold as brass. In front of witnesses. Well, what did I tell you about that one? You'd think that was the low point. It wasn't even close. But Ruth spent that night sick over it, certain she'd made everything worse, certain she'd handed the town the very rope they'd been wanting. She didn't understand yet what she'd set in motion. Neither did the town. Only Isaac knew, and Isaac wasn't telling, because here is what the old man did with that week. Nothing you could see. He went home to the ranch, and he told no one what he meant to do. Not his son Tom. Not Della, God knows. He went about the fall work, the gather, the cutting of the shipping steers, the mending of the far fence, and the whole time, behind that still gray face, he was weighing a thing out the way he'd weigh cattle on the scale. Slow, honest, to the pound. He knew what she'd asked for. He also knew it wouldn't work. He'd lived 61 years in towns like this one, and he knew a thing Ruth in her decency couldn't quite let herself believe. Sitting wasn't enough. Sitting at a dinner could be explained away by anybody who wanted to. 12 people at a table would go home and make 12 different stories out of it. She sat too close. He looked tired. They didn't speak. They spoke too much. A dinner was a whisper. And you cannot answer a shout with a whisper. He knew what would answer it, and he knew what it would cost him, down to the dollar. Because Isaac Coldwell was a man who always knew the price of a thing before he bought it. It would cost him the note. The Coldwell brand carried paper at the Ute Valley Stockman's Bank, $1,900 coming due in 60 days, and paper like that renews on one thing above all others. Confidence, the bank's confidence in the family's name, in Isaac's steadiness, in the plain fact that a Coldwell was a safe bet. And the fall steers, the whole shipment, were promised down to Halden and Ross, the livestock commission, on that same confidence, on the buyer's trust that the Coldwell outfit was exactly what it had always been. Solid, predictable, above talk. And what Isaac meant to do was make himself, for 1 hour, on the busiest day of the week, the most talked about man in the Uncompahgre Valley. He knew Della would be furious. He knew Tom would be caught square in the middle, between the father he owed everything to and the wife who was right about the money. He knew he might lose his seat on the stockman's committee, the standing he'd spent 30 years earning. He knew the talk that was chewing on Ruth Ballard would turn, the minute he did this, and come for him instead. He knew all of it. He decided anyway. He decided it in about the time it takes to weigh one steer, and he never once looked back at the decision, because that was not a thing Isaac Coldwell did. Why? You're wondering why. Why would a settled old man set fire to his own good name for a woman he barely knew over a thing he could have just declined? There's a reason. There's a reason with a date on it, and a name I've said once already, and you may have let slide right past you. But he wasn't going to tell it to Ruth. Or to you. Or to anybody. Not yet. He was just going to do the thing, and let the doing be the whole of the argument. Ruth spent that same week bracing for Sunday dinner. She couldn't help it. She'd asked for Sunday, and part of her was already flinching at the thought of walking into that church, everybody's eyes on her, sitting down beside an old rancher and trying to eat a plate of food while the whole congregation pretended not to watch. She got a dress ready. She lay awake practicing how she'd hold her face. She dreaded it, and she counted on it, both at once. That dinner was the one plan she had. Sunday came. And Isaac Coldwell sat at the near end of the church pew, alone, hat on his knee, exactly as he always did. He did not come to sit with her. He did not so much as cross the aisle. Ruth sat through the whole service with her heart in her shoes, certain now that he'd changed his mind. That Saturday, noon had just been a kind old man's way of letting her down easy and getting himself out of the store. She went home and she cried, a little, at that same kitchen table, and told herself she'd been a fool to ask, a fool to hope, and she resolved to just go on the way she'd been going. Head down. Account paid. Ask for nothing. She had 5 more days of that. 5 days of deciding he wasn't coming, and being almost relieved, and being ashamed of the relief. Then, it was Saturday again. Trading day. And this is the day the whole town of Alder Bend remembers. All of it. Every one of them, to the ends of their lives. It came up clear and cold and bright, that good September light that lies flat and gold along a valley street. And because it was trading day, the whole town was in. Every wagon in the country was tied along the rail. The boardwalks were full. The store was full. The saloons were filling. Men stood in knots by the freight scale and the pens. Women moved between the shops with their baskets. Children ran underfoot. 200 souls, maybe more, all of Alder Bend gathered in the one place on the one day. You could not have found a fuller street between there and Montrose. And a little before noon, out at her hay place 2 miles gone, Ruth Ballard heard a horse in the yard. She looked out, and it was Isaac Coldwell. Come at last. She'd near given up on him, and here he was, and her heart lifted and dropped both at once, because it was Saturday, not Sunday, and it was her yard, not the church, and none of it was the plan she'd made. He got down. He did not tie the horse to come in and sit. He stood at her gate, and he had his good hat on, brushed, square on his head, and he waited for her to come out to him. Ruth came down off the porch and out to the gate and stood on her side of it, and he stood on his, and for a second neither of them said a thing. Then Isaac Coldwell took off his hat, held it a moment, and put it back on. And he opened the gate, and he offered her his arm. "Mr. Coldwell," she said. "I don't. It's Saturday. I asked you for Sunday." "For the dinner, what?" "I know what you asked me," he said. "Quiet, level, not unkind. You asked me to sit with you so they'd stop talking." "Yes, Ruth," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her Christian name. Sitting's a whisper. "A table full of folks. They'll each go home and tell it their own way, and by Wednesday it'll be one more thing they've got on you." Sitting won't stop a soul. He held the arm out, steady, the elbow crooked, the good coat brushed. Behind him his horse stood ground tied in the cold gold light. "I mean to give this town something they can't unsee." She stared at him. "What are you talking about? Give them what?" He didn't explain. That was Isaac all over. He'd act a thing out to its last inch and never once stopped to say what it meant. He just held the arm there between them, patient as a fence post, and looked at her, and waited. And Ruth Ballard stood at her own gate on that bright cold Saturday, with 2 miles of road between her and a town packed shoulder to shoulder on its one long street at high noon, and she began, slowly, to understand that whatever this old man meant to do, it was not going to be small, and it was not going to be quiet, and there would be no taking it back once it started. She should have said no. Some part of her knew that, even then. She should have asked him, one more time, to just tell her plainly what he intended. She should have sent him home and kept her head down and gone on the way she'd always gone. Instead, she looked at his face, and at the offered arm, and at the road that led to town. And she reached out, and she took it. They walked the 2 miles side by side, and neither of them said much. The road ran flat and pale between the hayfields, and the aspens up the valley had gone to gold, and his horse he'd left behind at her gate. He meant to arrive on foot. She understood that much. A man on a horse rides through a town. A man on foot belongs to it. When the first roofs came up out of the low ground, she felt her arm go stiff on his. "They're all in," she said. "It's trading day." "I know it," he said. "That's why I picked it." The street opened in front of them. One long street, packed rail to rail. Wagons 3 deep at the freight scale. Horses at every post. 200 souls in from every draw and bench in the county, and every one of them out in the noon light with somewhere to be. Isaac Coldwell set his hat, and he did not lengthen his stride, and he walked her into it. The first house on the street was the Pruitt place. Mrs. Pruitt was on her porch, with a basket of wash on her hip. She was the one who'd started it. 11 weeks back, it had been her mouth that first shaped the word advertising over a fence line to a neighbor. And here came Ruth Ballard up the middle of the road on the arm of the most respected man in Alder Bend, and Mrs. Pruitt went still. The basket stopped against her hip. Her mouth opened a little and shut again. She did not have anything ready for this. Nobody had told her what to say about this. Ruth kept her eyes level and her chin where it was, and they went on past. And behind them the wash sat unhung in the basket a long while. The general store came next. That was the worst of them, because that was where the counter was, and the counter was where they'd hushed her 11 weeks running. Word had already run ahead. Word always runs ahead, and the counter crowd had spilled out onto the boardwalk to see. 10, 12 of them, the Vance sisters among them, who'd heard her make the ask. They stood along the rail with their packages in their arms, and they watched the two of them come. The storekeeper stepped out onto his own step. He was a decent enough man who'd never once stood up for her, and never once needed to be the first to talk. He looked at Isaac, and he looked at Ruth on Isaac's arm, and some old habit of respect took over his hands before his head could stop them, and he took off his hat. He didn't know why. He stood there, holding it, uncertain, like a man who'd stood up in church at the wrong moment. Isaac gave him the smallest nod, kept walking, and every soul on that boardwalk understood, in that 1 second, that they were being asked to choose, and that the man doing the asking had never in 30 years asked for a thing he didn't mean. The first saloon was across and down. The men had come to the doors. They always come to the doors. One of them, half in the sun, called out something, not the worst word, but a word, a laugh riding under it, meant to land on the both of them, and see them flinch. Isaac did not turn his head. That was the thing Ruth would remember longest. He did not turn his head, and he did not tip his hat to the man, and he did not tip it to the doorway or the laugh or the whole watching street. He kept it level. He kept it right where it sat. A man tips his hat to say, "I see you, we're square." Isaac gave that street nothing. He was not there to be square with them. He was there to be seen, and to see her seen, and the hat stayed level the whole length of it. The man in the saloon door waited for his laugh to catch, and it did not catch, and he stepped back inside. The bank was the next building down. Stone front, tall windows. And in the near window, looking out, stood Tom Coldwell, Isaac's own son, with the ledgers of the Coldwell brand in his head, and the note that came due in the fall, and every dollar of it riding on the family name. Beside him stood Della, Tom's wife. She had one hand flat against the glass. Her face was white and set. She watched her father-in-law walk a 34-year-old widow down the open street at high noon, and Ruth saw her lips move, saw her say something short and hard to Tom, and Tom did not answer. He only watched his father go by. Isaac did not look at the window. He knew it was there. He'd known it would be there. He walked on. Past the bank the street ran slow. The second saloon, the freight scale, the crowd thickest of all where the wagons queued to weigh. This was the hardest stretch, the longest, the most eyes packed in the least ground, and here, where a man would want to be through it fast, Isaac shortened his stride. He slowed. He walked her through that press of staring people the way you'd walk a church aisle, unhurried, letting every last one of them get the full look at it so no one could ever say afterward they hadn't been sure what they saw. Ruth's heart was going like a hammer. She matched his step. She did not hurry either. She would not give them that. At the end of the street stood the church. White board, plain steeple, the pew inside where Isaac sat alone at the near end every Sunday of the world. And here, Only here, in all that walk, Isaac Coldwell lifted his hat. Not to the people. He never gave the people his hat. He lifted it to the building. A short, plain motion, the brim coming up off his gray head and settling back, the kind of thing a man does at a grave. Ruth didn't understand it. Not that day. It would be a while yet, before she understood who he was tipping it to, and why, and what winter he was answering. Then, he turned her, gentle, back toward the wagons. 11 minutes. That was the whole of it. Later somebody would work out it had been about 11 minutes. Gate of the town to church, and back to the wagons, and the number would sit strange next to the 11 weeks of talk it undid. He walked her to her rig. He set his hand under her arm and handed her up to the seat, steady, like she was made of something that mattered. And then, and only then, he touched the brim of his hat. To her. To her alone, not to the street. The street got a level hat the whole way. She got the touch of it at the end. "Go on home, Ruth," he said, low. "You did fine." And he stepped back. And he let her drive out, and he walked back up that street alone, on foot, through all of them, the same slow way he'd come. Here is the thing the town could not see yet, standing there in the noon light with their packages in their arms. A dinner would have made a dozen stories. 12 people at a table go home 12 ways. One says she looked desperate. One says he looked trapped. One says charity. One says scandal. By Wednesday it's a new thing to chew. But 200 people watched one walk. And a walk has no second version. There is nothing to interpret in a man giving a woman his arm the length of the street at noon and daring the whole county to make something small of it. You cannot repeat it wrong at your supper table, because your neighbor saw the same 11 minutes you did. The story about Ruth Ballard's porch lamp, the story that had lived on nothing and grown fat on repeating, it had nowhere left to go. It could not survive a thing everyone had seen with their own eyes. By Monday the store was quiet around her. Not the old quiet, not the hush that dropped when she reached the counter. A different quiet. The quiet of people who have run out of the thing they were saying and haven't yet found what comes next. For the first time in 11 weeks, Ruth Ballard paid her account and nobody looked away. But the talk did not die. That was the part Isaac had known, and Ruth had not. It moved. By Tuesday it wasn't about the widow's lamp anymore. It was about the old man. Because that's what a town does. It doesn't stop talking. It just finds new ground. And the new ground was Isaac. "What does it mean," folks said, an established stockman, 61 years old, widowed 9 years, walking a woman half his age down the middle of the street like that? What's he after? At his age? And what would Ada have thought? Ada gone 9 years and not cold enough, some said, for this. And what must his own family make of it? Worse for him. Better for her. That was the trade. That was precisely the trade, and he had made it with his eyes open, and he had not told her he was making it, and that was the thing that was going to bring her to his gate, with her jaw set. The cost was not just talk. Della made sure of that. She came to the ranch Tuesday, and she said it out loud, in the kitchen, with Tom standing there not able to look at either of them. "You've got the note," she said. $1,900 at Ute Valley, and it falls due in 60 days, and you know as well as I do, the only reason that bank carries a rancher 2 months into the fall is the Coldwell name. And Halden and Ross, the steers are promised to Halden and Ross on a handshake, and that handshake is your word, Isaac, your name. The thing you spent 30 years building, and you walked it down the street on Saturday like it was yours to spend. "It is mine to spend," Isaac said. "It's Tom's too. It's mine too. It's your grandchildren's." Her voice cracked, and she brought it back hard. A buyer buys beef, but a buyer buys the man too, and right now half this county is asking what's wrong with the man. Talk about you is money, Isaac. It's the note. You want to help that woman, help her quiet, Help her with a sack of flour on her porch. Don't drag this family through the street to do it. Tom finally spoke. Pa, quiet. Was it worth it? Isaac looked at his son a long moment. Yes, he said. And I'll carry the note. Whatever it costs, it comes off me. Not off you two. You have my word on that. And my word's still good at that bank, whatever this town does with it. Wait and see. Della turned and walked out. She did not slam the door. She just went, and she did not speak to Isaac Coldwell again for the better part of a season, and he let her go, and he did not pretend it didn't cut him. Ruth worked the whole of it out on Tuesday night, alone at her kitchen table, with the lamp burning late, the way it always had, the way that started all of it, and she left it burning now on purpose. She saw it plain, the way you see a thing you should have seen from the start. He had not misunderstood her. That was the part that turned her cold. He'd understood better than she had. She'd asked for a whisper, and he'd known it was a whisper, and he'd given her a shout instead, and he had known standing at her gate on Saturday that the shout would turn and land on him. He hadn't guessed it might. He'd counted on it. He'd chosen it. He had walked into that street knowing the town would take the story off her and hang it on him. The note and the buyer and Ada's memory and all, and he had not said one word to her about the price, had not asked her, had not given her the chance to say no. Not like that. Not at your cost. And by Wednesday she was in her wagon before she'd half decided to be, driving up the valley to the Coldwell gate, not grateful. Angry. He came out to the gate when he heard the rig. Hat on. He always had the hat on. I didn't ask you for this, she said. She didn't get down. She said it from the seat, looking down at him, and her voice was shaking, and it wasn't from cold. I asked you to sit with me. 1 hour. 1 dinner. I asked you for the smallest thing I could think to ask, because I didn't want to cost anybody anything. And you took it. And you made it into the biggest thing this town has seen in 9 years, and you never once asked me if I wanted it that big. You'd have said no, Isaac said. That was mine to say. The words cracked out of her and hung in the cold air, and he did not flinch from them. You spent your name, she said. Lower, now. Your note. Della won't look at you. Your own family. You spent all of it on me, and you didn't ask, and now they're saying things about you, at your age, about you and me, and I have to live with knowing a good man got dragged down for the crime of being kind to me, and I never got a vote in it. You think you did me a mercy, you did me a debt I can't ever pay, and never agreed to owe. He was quiet a moment. The wind moved in the aspens. You're right, he said. I didn't ask you. I'd do it the same again. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. Not yet. He looked up at her, and for a second there was something behind his face, some old grief moving under it like water under ice, and then it was gone. Get on home, Ruth. It'll settle. Not the way you're afraid of. Trust the note to hold. It'll hold. She reached for the traces. He stepped up beside the wheel and put out his arm to steady her. The same arm, crooked the same way, an old habit, to help her turn the rig. She did not take it. She looked at the offered arm, and she looked at him, and she gathered the reins herself, and turned the wagon herself, and drove out of that yard without touching him. And Isaac Coldwell stood at his own gate and watched her go, and he let her, and the argument stood there unfinished between them like a fence, with the last post not set. The note held. That was the plain end of the fear, and it came in plain. The stockman's meeting was cool to him. Men who'd shaken his hand for 30 years found reasons to be across the room, and when the committee seat came up in the fall, his name was quietly not put forward again, and he let it go without a word, because it was gone, and pretending otherwise fools nobody. Della kept her silence. That cut deepest and lasted longest, and he bore it. But the note. The note came due, and Ute Valley Stockman's Bank renewed it, Because Coldwell cattle weighed what Coldwell said they'd weigh, and Coldwell's word had never once come up short at that window, and a bank in the fall of 1889 lent against beef and character, not against what the church dinner crowd was chewing on that month. And Halden, of Halden and Ross, drove up the valley himself, looked at the fall steers on the hoof, and bought them at the handshake price, because Halden was a plain dealer who'd been buying beef off honest men his whole life and knew the difference between a man's name and a town's mood. He shook Isaac's hand at the loading pens and said, "Fine cattle? Coldwell, same as ever," and never said one word about the street. Because to a man like Halden there was nothing there to say. And Tom, quiet, without any speech about it, sided with his father. Started riding the near range with him again, stood next to him at the pens when Halden came. It didn't mend Della's silence, but it told the county something. A son standing at his father's shoulder, and the county read it. Isaac Coldwell's standing came back. Not because the talk cleared. Talk doesn't clear, it just tires. But because the beef weighed out and the word held and the son stood by the father, and a man standing, the real kind, was never made of talk in the first place. It was made of the thing he does when it costs him. And the whole valley had watched what he did when it cost him, and slowly, the way ground settles after a hard rain, they remembered what he was. The next Saturday was trading day again. Same long street, same 200 souls, same counter. Ruth Ballard drove in alone, the way she always had, and paid cash, the way she always had. And when she reached the store counter, the crowd did not go quiet. She stood there with her account book in her hands, the same account book, the same counter, the same women along the rail, and the talk went right on around her. Ordinary talk, weather and prices and whose fence was down, and none of it stopped for her, and none of it was about her, and it was the finest silence she had ever not heard. And out on the Pruitt porch, as she drove out, Mrs. Pruitt was there with her wash again. And Mrs. Pruitt, the woman whose mouth had started the whole of it 11 weeks and a lifetime ago, looked up and caught Ruth's eye and nodded to her. First, before Ruth could decide whether to nod, the woman who'd wounded her nodded first, on the same porch, in front of the same street, and the town's one story now ran the other way down the same road it had come. Ruth carried her account book out to the wagon and set it on the seat and climbed up, and she did not flinch, and this time, this was the whole of the gift, it meant nothing at all that she didn't. She was just a woman who'd bought her month's supplies. Nobody's story. Free, Isaac came to her gate 5 days after that, a little before noon. She saw him from the window and went out. He was on foot again. And the hat that had turned in his hands at the counter, the hat that had stayed dead level the whole length of the street for the whole town, the hat was off. He held it against his chest with both hands. He'd taken it off before he reached her gate. "Mr. Coldwell," she said. "Ruth," he turned the brim once in his fingers and then held it still. "I owe you the answer, the one I didn't have Wednesday. You asked me why I did it big, and why I didn't ask you, and you had the right of it, and I've come to say the rest." She waited. 9 years back, he said, there was a widow in this town. Letty Sharp. Younger than you by a little. Her man died, and the talk got hold of her the same way it got hold of you. Out of nothing, out of a lamp and a look. And it wouldn't let go. And my Ada was still with me then. Ada came to me one winter morning, and she said, "Isaac, walk that woman down the street. Everybody'll follow your lead. Walk her down the street and they'll have to stop." And I said no. I said it'd cost too much. The note, the name, what folks would make of it. I was careful. I was so careful. He stopped. His jaw worked once. That was 1878, and by that spring Letty Sharp was in the ground, and this town called it a hard winter, and it was a hard winter, but it wasn't the cold that took her. I let a woman go under to keep my hat clean, and my wife knew it, and my wife carried it to her own grave, and I have stood at the near end of that pew every Sunday for 9 years knowing there was a walk I owed and never made. The wind moved. Ruth did not speak. So I don't aim to be that careful twice, Isaac said. That's your answer. I didn't ask you, because I asked myself in 1878, and I gave myself the smart answer and it killed somebody. The walk Saturday was for you. But the first 11 minutes of it, Ruth, some of it was for her. And some of it was for Ada. I lifted my hat at the church for the two of them. That's who was standing there. And Ruth understood, standing at her own gate in the daylight. All of it at once. Why the street and not the table? Why he wouldn't be talked out of it? Why he'd spent his name without counting? Why an old man had walked into 200 pairs of eyes and never turned his head? The anger went out of her the way heat goes out of iron, slow and complete. It was never only her he'd been walking for. He'd been paying a debt 11 years old to 2 women in the ground. And he'd been paying it the only way a debt like that can be paid, out loud, in the open, where the whole town has to watch and can't ever unwatch. She did not thank him. Thanks were too small, and anyway, he hadn't come for them. She reached out, and she opened the gate. He did not come through it. Not yet. He stood on his side of it, with his hat against his chest, and she stood on hers, with the gate swung open between them, and that was enough for the both of them. That day, the open gate and the man who'd waited to be let through it, instead of walking through on his own account. Behind her, in the front window, the lamp sat dark, unlit. It was noon, and there was no need of it, and for the first time in a long time the dark lamp in Ruth Ballard's window meant nothing to anybody at all. Just a lamp. Waiting for evening. The way a lamp is supposed to. Some stories can't be answered with words. You can deny a thing 1,000 times and only feed it, but you can walk down the middle of the street at noon, slow, with your hat level and your arm steady, and let 200 people see one true thing they can never repeat wrong. And sometimes, that's the only answer there is. It's never too late to make the walk you should have made. Isaac Coldwell was 61 years old, and he'd waited 11 years. And he made it. If this one stayed with you, comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far it travels.